The Oak Ridge Courthouse had never seen such an unequal battle. On one side, Judge Harrison, a man whose arrogance was as vast as his power, determined to crush a humble woman to protect the interests of a corrupt contractor. On the other, Sarah, a widow struggling only to keep a roof over her grandchildren's heads. When the judge, in a fit of sarcastic laughter, dared Sarah to seek help anywhere, he didn't know that the phone in the woman's trembling hands held a single number capable of paralyzing the entire state. What Harrison didn't know was that Sarah's past had a secret kept for decades, and who answered that call would transform the courtroom into a scene of reckoning that no one in that town would ever forget. The air conditioning in the Oak Ridge Courthouse seemed to blow ice straight to Sarah's bones. She sat on the polished wooden bench, feeling tiny against the vast oak walls and the marble coat of arms hanging above Judge Miller Harrison's head. Sarah clutched her hands in her lap, trying to hide the trembling that betrayed her exhaustion. At 65, she never imagined she would spend her afternoons in a courtroom, battling men in expensive suits who wanted to turn a small garden into a parking lot for a new luxury complex. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers on his desk with barely disguised boredom. He was a robust man with perfectly combed gray hair and a voice that sounded like controlled thunder. Harrison wasn't just a judge. He was an institution in the city, known for his dinners with the mayor and his iron fist in cases involving urban development. To him, Sarah was merely a bureaucratic obstacle, a stain of old feelings in the way of millions of dollars in investments. "Mrs. Miller," Harrison began, his voice echoing through the nearly empty hall, "I have already read your petition 3 times. You claim that the property has belonged to your family since 1940, but Green Horizon Development has presented a deed of expropriation signed by the city. The law is clear. Public interest prevails over nostalgia." "Your Excellency," Sarah rose slowly, her voice faltering slightly, "this isn't nostalgia. It's the only home my grandchildren have known since my son passed away. That land was paid for with the sweat of my late husband, who served this country. The city never sent me a notification. I only found out when the bulldozers showed up on my sidewalk." Across the hall, the contractor's lawyer, a young man named Mark, smirked as he checked the gold watch on his wrist. He didn't even bother to feign interest. He knew the game was won. Judge Harrison let out a heavy sigh and slammed the briefcase shut, making Sarah jump. "Mrs. Miller, I'm not here to hear about family tragedies. I'm here to enforce the law. Unless you have a superior court order or leverage that changes the technical facts, I'm going to sign the eviction order right now. You have until the end of the day to remove your belongings." Sarah felt tears welling up, but she held them back. She glanced at Lawyer Mark, who was now whispering something in an assistant's ear, and then looked back at the judge. There was something personal about Harrison's cruelty, a rush to destroy her that she couldn't understand. "You're making a mistake, Your Excellency. If you sign this, you'll be ignoring the fraud they committed with the documents. I know you and the owner of Green Horizon are friends. I saw the photos in the local newspaper. This isn't justice." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The security guard at the back of the room straightened up. Harrison's face turned from a pale gray to a deep red. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, fixing his eyes on Sarah with a contempt bordering on hatred. "Are you accusing me of bias? In my own court?" Harrison gave a short, dry, humorless laugh. "Mrs. Miller, you're an ordinary woman, without resources and without friends in high places. You can shout all you want. You can call the press. You can call the mayor. You can call whoever you want. Nobody will listen to a bitter old woman against a word of this court. Call whoever you want. Right now, let's see who cares." Sarah looked at the old cell phone on the table, a simple device with a slightly cracked screen. She remembered the promise she had made 30 years ago, that she would never use that number unless her life or the lives of her loved ones were in real danger. She had always prided herself on her independence, on never asking for favors. But now, seeing the mocking smile on Harrison's face and the arrogance of Lawyer Mark, she realized that honesty alone was not a sufficient shield against tyranny. With trembling fingers, Sarah picked up the phone. She didn't look at the contacts. She dialed a number from memory, a number that had never been saved in her address book, but which was etched in her mind like a prayer. I will do it, Your Excellency, Sarah said, with a sudden calm that made Harrison's laughter die in his throat. I will make the call you suggested. Sarah pressed the call button. The silence in the courtroom was so thick that the sound of the keys typing resembled the firing of a small gun. Judge Harrison, his face still flushed with indignation, leaned back in his high-quality leather chair, crossing his arms over his robe. He exchanged a knowing glance with Lawyer Mark, who let out a muffled chuckle. To them, this scene was a culmination of the despair of a woman who had already lost everything. "Go ahead, Mrs. Miller," Harrison sneered, his voice thick with venomous sarcasm. "Have your neighbor come here with a machete, or maybe call your pastor to pray for your soul. I guarantee the eviction notice will be signed before they even answer. Time is money, and you're making us lose both." Sarah didn't answer. She put the phone to her ear and closed her eyes. The first ring echoed in the receiver, then the second. On the third ring, the call was answered. There was no casual hello. There was professional silence on the other end, followed by a deep, grave male voice that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 important decisions. "Private emergency line. Identify yourself," said the voice. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the cold courtroom air finally reach her lungs completely. "It's Sarah Miller, from Oak Ridge." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but which seemed like an eternity to Sarah. Then the tone of voice changed completely. The professional coldness gave way to genuine shock and a respect bordering on reverence. "Mrs. Miller? For God's sake, 30 years. We've been monitoring that number every day for 3 decades. Where are you? What's going on?" "I'm in the Oak Ridge Small Claims Court before Judge Miller Harrison." Sarah spoke clearly, her eyes fixed on the judges, who began to frown, intrigued by the woman's sudden posture. "They're trying to take the house Thomas built. They forged the documents, and the judge gave me until sunset to leave. He told me to call whomever I wanted. So I called you." "Don't hang up the phone, Sarah. Put it on speakerphone and leave it on the table." Now, Sarah obeyed. She set the crack screen device down on the polished wood. Harrison leaned forward, curiosity momentarily overcoming irritation. "What's this, Miller? Who's this clown on the phone?" the judge asked, laughing at the empty gallery. "Some nephew who works at a mechanic's shop?" The voice that came through the cell phone speaker wasn't that of a mechanic. It was a voice of someone accustomed to commanding armies, silencing rooms full of senators, and deciding the course of the national economy. "Judge Miller Harrison?" the voice on the phone asked, without a trace of doubt. "Yes, it's me. And who the hell are you to interrupt the session of this court?" Harrison shouted, banging his gavel on the bench. "I'll have that woman arrested for contempt and you for obstruction." "My name is Samuel Sterling," the voice replied calmly. "I am the Attorney General of the United States. And if you don't withdraw this eviction order within the next 60 seconds, I'm not just going to have you arrested. I'm going to make sure the FBI dismantles every bank transaction you've made with Green Horizon over the last 5 years. I know your name, Harrison. I know your payroll. And I know the woman you're trying to humiliate." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Attorney Mark, who had been relaxed, felt a sudden chill down his spine. He would recognize that voice anywhere. He heard it on the national news every night. Samuel Sterling was not only the most powerful man in the federal judiciary, he was known as the Incorruptible. Harrison paled. The red of his anger was replaced by a cadaverous gray. He stared at the cell phone on Sarah's desk as if it were a grenade about to explode. His lips trembled. He tried to form a sentence, but his throat felt constricted. "Prosecutor Sterling? This has to be a prank. Ms. Miller, this is a very bad joke." "This isn't a prank call, Harrison," Sterling's voice thundered, now devoid of any patience. "Sarah Miller is the widow of Thomas Miller, the man who saved my life and the lives of 4 senators in an ambush 30 years ago. The man who died so that this country could keep running. We promised him we would take care of her. She never asked for anything, not a penny. But today, you gave her a reason call." Harrison felt his hands sweating. He looked to the contractor's lawyer for support, but Mark was already putting his papers away in his briefcase, his eyes downcast, trying to become invisible. The judge realized that the ground beneath his feet had just turned into quicksand. He looked at Sarah, no longer as a bitter old woman, but as someone who could erase him from existence with a single gesture. Sarah remained motionless. Her mind drifted back to the night. Uniformed officers knocked on her door to tell her Thomas wouldn't be returning. She remembered young Samuel, then a legal assistant, who had wept at her husband's funeral, vowing that Thomas's sacrifice would never be forgotten. She had kept the number, but always felt Thomas would have wanted her to go on alone, with honor. But honor doesn't pay corrupt lawyers, and honor doesn't stop bulldozers. Your Excellency? Sarah asked, her soft voice contrasting with the chaos swirling in the judge's mind. Do you still want me to leave before sunset? Judge Harrison felt a bead of cold sweat trickle behind his ear, disappearing into the starched collar of his $100 shirt. The wooden gavel, which he had gripped so tightly minutes before as a symbol of his earthly divinity, now felt like it weighed a ton. He glanced at the cell phone on Sarah's desk, and then at his own hand, which trembled uncontrollably. The arrogance that had shaped his career for decades had evaporated, leaving behind only a terrified man, trapped in the web he himself had woven. And Mr. Attorney General, Harrison stammered, his voice rising an octave, losing all authority. There's been a colossal misunderstanding. I wasn't aware of Ms. Miller's background. The document submitted by Green Horizon seemed technically sound. I was simply following protocol. Lies. Samuel Sterling's voice cut through the explanation like a razor through silk. You weren't following protocol, Harrison. You were following the schedule of a contractor who secretly funded your last re-election campaign. I have your file open on my screen right now. The Justice Department has been monitoring Oak Ridge for months on suspicion of malfeasance and expropriations. You just gave us the reason we needed to kick down your door. The lawyer Mark, realizing that the boat was sinking faster than he could swim, stood up abruptly. Your Honor, if I may, Green Horizon would like to withdraw the eviction notice immediately for an internal review of the documents. It appears there was an administrative error on our surveying team's end. Sit down, Mr. Thompson, the voice on speakerphone ordered, and Mark froze in place as if struck by lightning. You and your clients aren't going anywhere. There are federal agents on their way to the Green Horizon office right now. And Sarah leaned closer to the device, the tears she had held back throughout the hearing finally beginning to flow warmly down her wrinkled face. Samuel, I beg pardon on behalf of the government of this country. The voice of the most powerful man in the judiciary softened, laden with genuine emotion that silenced even the hum of the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Thomas Miller was a hero who saved lives that now govern this world. The fact that you were dragged into the dock because of greed is a stain I will personally erase. Don't hang up. I want to hear this man overturn the decision. Harrison looked at Sarah. He saw in her not the image of a victim, but the image of his own destruction. He knew that every word spoken in that courtroom was being recorded, and that the end of his career was sealed no matter what he did. But the instinct for self-preservation prevailed. Mrs. Miller, Harrison began, clearing his throat and trying to recover a shred of dignity that no longer existed. In light of the new facts presented and the evident irregularity in the plaintiff's documents, I declare this hearing closed. The eviction order is annulled. Furthermore, I issue a permanent injunction protecting your property, prohibiting any construction or alteration within a 5-kilometer radius of your residence until a full federal investigation is completed. He banged the gavel, but the sound wasn't one of authority. It was the sound of a coffin closing. Sarah, Samuel called on the phone. An official car will arrive at the courthouse in 10 minutes to take you home safely. I'll be in Oak Ridge tomorrow morning. I want to have that coffee Thomas always said was the best in the world. I'll be waiting, Samuel, Sarah replied, her voice firm now, filled with strength that came from generations of women who never bowed down. With the coffee ready. And thank you. She hung up the phone. The courtroom, which had previously seemed like a cold dungeon, was now illuminated by the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows. Sarah picked up her worn purse and began walking toward the exit. She passed Lawyer Mark, who was pale and fixed in place, and stopped before the judge's bench. Harrison couldn't look at her. He pretended to organize useless papers, his hands still trembling. "You told me to call whomever I wanted," Sarah said, her tone calm, without rancor, just with the clarity of truth. "I hope you learn that justice doesn't belong to the office you hold, but to the people you swore to protect. My husband died for this court, Judge Harrison. It's a pity you didn't live for him." She turned and walked toward the double wooden doors. The sound of her shoes on the marble floor echoed like the beating of a heart that had begun to beat again. As she opened the doors, the air outside was fresh, smelling of freshly cut grass and freedom. But as she walked down the outside corridor, she heard quick footsteps behind her. It wasn't the security guard, nor the lawyer. It was the bailiff, a man who had watched everything in silence and who now had an expression of utter shock and awe. "Mrs. Miller," he called, pausing to catch his breath. "The judge. He's locked in his office. He just received an official suspension notice by email. I've never seen anything like this happen so fast. Who was that man, really?" Sarah stopped and looked out at the courthouse garden, where the flowers were beginning to bloom under the golden light. "He's just someone who remembers the importance of a promise," Sarah replied with a half-smile. "And someone who knows that sometimes the little ones need a giant to fight their battles." She kept walking, but what she didn't know was that, inside that courtroom, Lawyer Mark was now being questioned by two men in dark suits who had just entered through the back. The corruption network that sustained the city was being dismantled brick by brick, and it had all started with a phone with a cracked screen. Sarah left the courthouse and sat on one of the stone benches in Oak Ridge's central square. The afternoon sun, in its warmest orange hue, bathed the trees, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down. She watched the people passing by, oblivious to the earthquake that had just occurred within those marble walls. To everyone else, she was just an elderly lady resting. But inside, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in decades. She closed her eyes and in the silence of her mind whispered, "We did it. Thomas, our house is safe." While waiting for the car Samuel had promised, Sarah saw Lawyer Mark rush out through the side doors of the courthouse. He no longer had his arrogant posture. He carried his leather briefcase like a shield, glancing around paranoidly. He had barely reached his luxury car parked in a no-parking spot when two men in dark suits and sunglasses approached him silently and efficiently. There was no fuss, just a brief exchange and a metallic glint of handcuffs being placed under the cuffs of his expensive shirt. Mark was led to a black SUV that appeared like a specter around the corner. Justice, which for years had seemed an abstract and slow concept in Oak Ridge, now moved with lightning speed. 10 minutes later, exactly as promised, a pristine black sedan pulled up in front of Sarah. A young driver, with a military bearing, got out and opened the back door with a bow that drew the attention of onlookers. "Ms. Miller, the Attorney General has asked me to escort you to your residence and remain there until the arrival of the federal security team. My name is Agent Collins." Sarah nodded in thanks and got into the vehicle. During the drive to her small property on the outskirts of town, she observed the road she knew so well. She passed a sign for Green Horizon Enterprises, where tractors and workers stood still, looking at each other, unsure what to do. Some were talking on their cell phones with panicked expressions. The news of Judge Harrison's suspension and the federal intervention was already spreading to the town like wildfire. When Sarah arrived home, she found her two grandchildren, Leo and Mia, playing in the garden. They were unaware of the eviction threat. Sarah had spared them that burden. Seeing their grandmother getting out of such an imposing car, the children ran to meet her, full of questions. "Grandma, who is this young man?" "Is he a king?" asked little Leo, 6 years old, looking at Agent Collins' suit. Sarah laughed, the first genuine, light-hearted laugh in weeks. "No, dear, he's just a friend of an old friend of your grandfather's. He came to make sure our garden remains the most beautiful place in the world." She entered the house and smelled the familiar scent of lavender and old wood. Every crack in the floorboards, every stain on the wall told a story. She went to the small fireplace and looked at the photo of Thomas in his uniform. He had a wide smile and eyes that seemed to see into the future. Sarah ran her finger across the glass of the frame. "You always said we'd never be alone, didn't you?" she murmured. Agent Collins, who was standing on the porch, received a call on his radio. He entered the house discreetly and asked permission to leave. "Mrs. Miller, I apologize for the interruption. I received an update. Judge Harrison has just formally resigned from his position, but the Department of Justice has denied the resignation request. They will proceed with the impeachment and removal process to ensure he loses all benefits and faces criminal charges of unlawful imprisonment and corruption. Samuel Sterling wants you to know that your testimony will be crucial in cleaning up the city." Sarah sat in her favorite armchair. She felt the weight of the responsibility, but she wasn't afraid. The fear had stayed on that courtroom bench. When Harrison had laughed at her, "I'll do whatever it takes, Collins. If Thomas gave his life for this country, the least I could do is lend my voice." Night fell over Oak Ridge, but it was no ordinary night. Lights shone in the windows of the town hall and the Green Horizon headquarters, where federal investigators worked tirelessly. Sarah, however, turned off the lights in her house early. She prepared the coffee maker for the next day, carefully grinding the beans. She knew Samuel Sterling would come, and with him, she would bring not only justice, but the memory of a time when words had value and promises were sacred. As she lay down, Sarah heard the sound of the wind in the oak trees of her yard. For the first time in a long time, the sound didn't seem like a lament, but a lullaby. She knew that tomorrow's battle would be long, that many secrets would still be revealed, and that Oak Ridge would never be the same again. But as she closed her eyes, she had an unshakable certainty. The giant had awakened, and he was on her side. The morning in Oak Ridge dawned under a crystal-clear blue sky, as if the atmosphere itself had been cleansed of the grime accumulated by years of corruption. Sarah woke before her alarm clock, guided by the habit of a lifetime of work. The sound of the coffee maker bubbling in the kitchen was the only noise in the silent house, a harbinger of peace. She put on her best Sunday dress, a simple but impeccable navy blue fabric, and fastened the silver brooch Thomas had given her on their 10th wedding anniversary. At 8 o'clock sharp, the sound of tires on the gravel announced the giant's arrival. Sarah opened the door and saw Samuel Sterling getting out of the back seat of a black SUV. He wasn't wearing his judge's robes or the formal suits he wore to press conferences in Washington. He was in jeans, worn leather boots, and a field jacket. Seeing Sarah on the porch, the man who made senators tremble paused for a second, and his eyes glistened with a moisture he didn't try to hide. "Sarah," he said, his voice choked with emotion, as he climbed the steps and enveloped her in a tight embrace. "Forgive me. Forgive us for taking so long to look at the city." "You came, Samuel. That's what matters," Sarah replied, patting him lightly on the back. The coffee's on the table. They sat in the kitchen, the same place where Thomas and Samuel used to draw up security plans decades ago. For 2 hours, they didn't talk about lawsuits, Harrison, or Green Horizon. They talked about Thomas. They talked about how much he loved that garden and how he believed the world could still be fixed if there were people willing to be honest when it was difficult. "Judge Harrison tried to strike a deal early this morning," Samuel commented, finally returning to reality as he took a sip of his strong coffee. "He offered to give up all the names in the corruption ring in exchange for keeping his pension. I refused. He's going to federal prison, Sarah, and he's going to lose every penny he made selling sentences. The Justice Department is temporarily taking over administration of Oak Ridge to ensure that the properties of all the other families who were wronged are returned. You didn't just save your home, Sarah. You opened the floodgates so that thousands of people could get justice." Sarah looked at her hands on the wooden table. She didn't feel the satisfaction of revenge, but the fulfillment of a duty accomplished. "I just wanted my grandchildren to grow up knowing that truth has value, Samuel, that the money of a judge or a construction company cannot buy the soul of someone who is not for sale." At noon, Samuel had to leave. His work in Washington called him, and the political hurricane he had unleashed in Oak Ridge was only beginning. As they said goodbye on the porch, Samuel handed Sarah a small leather envelope. "What is that?" she asked. "This is official recognition of Thomas's service. He never wanted medals, but the government decided that this house and this land are now considered a National Historic Landmark under federal protection. No one, Sarah, will ever be able to put a tractor here again, not even in 100 years." Sarah watched Samuel's car disappear down the road. She walked to the center of her garden and took a deep breath. The air felt lighter. She saw her grandchildren running among the apple trees, laughing loudly, protected by a legacy that was invisible to the eye, but unbreakable as steel.